Hey guys, I'm Rob Younkers. I'm a fashion and costume designer with 20 plus years of experience, an educator and lover of all things DIY. That's why I'm so excited to introduce you to Threadymade. Threadymade kits bring you New York City Garment District insider access that you've never had before. Threadymade pleating and smocking kits are going to allow you to create things that you've never been able to make at home before, and they're gonna be key pieces in your new wardrobe. The great thing about these kits, they're accessible to people of all skill levels as far as sewing goes, and we cater to all shapes and sizes, so Threadymade is very inclusive. The other fun part, we're gonna show you the steps to create these pieces, but we also wanna know what you would do with them, how to put your own creative touch on them. So are you guys excited to start sewing? I'm gonna walk you through all the steps. Ready, set, go! So the kit contents, let's run through them. The first is the skirt itself. So this comes, obviously, pre-pleated for you. And if you notice, the baby hem is done. So this is the longer length that comes in 2 different lengths. Also, if you choose to do the exposed elastic waistband, that's already attached for you as well. However, if you want to do the other option, you've got elastic to insert into the tunnel elastic option, and your self fabric. So self fabric is the fabric that would be the same as the body of the skirt. So we have the self waistband fabric. So here's the 2 options. For the beginner sewer, this is definitely the one I would go with. It's the exposed elastic waistband that's already pre-attached, and you're just measuring and sewing together the side seams. The sort of intermediate option is the tunnel elastic version. So again, this is where we're using self-covered elastic for the waist. Pulls on and off really easy, also a cool look. So let's get sewing. So the first thing you need to do before starting to make your side pleated skirt is get a waist measurement. So I got my best friend Maureen here to get her waist measurement, and she's gonna show you guys at home how to get yours. Okay, so Mo, all you're gonna do is take this around the back in both hands at the smallest part of your waist there. Make sure, you guys, that your tape measure's not twisting. You want it to be, you know, fitted, not too tight, not super loose. You wanna make sure the skirt stays on. Does that feel good, Maureen? Cool, you guys. So then all you're gonna do is take the measurement where you started at the beginning at center front. And I'm gonna take this to the table, pin it together, and we'll try it on. So for a 30-inch waist, I'm going to lay out the side pleated panel. What we wanna do is first take a look at how this pleat is constructed. So what you have are pleats that are folded all in one direction across the entire panel. You can see they go from right to left. Our goal with creating the side seam for this skirt is to hide our seam underneath one of the pleated panels. So for the sake of the video, we'll call the outside fold the peak. So these would be our peaks. A peak, a peak, a peak, a peak, and the underside we'll call the valleys. So I'm opening up and you can see a valley, a valley, a valley. The goal is, with our measurement, with our pinning, to hide our side seam in a valley. So I'm going to flip the skirt to the wrong side. And on the wrong side of the fabric, this is a valley. As you can see, I flip it. We are underneath the pleat. We've created a chart to make this really simple. Find your waist measurement, then mark out the number of pleats needed for your size. Then follow the chart to cut your tunnel elastic and waistband lengths. So in order to accommodate for seam allowance and any changes we may need to make during our fitting, I'm going to start at least 2 inches in from one side of our skirt panel. And remember, I'm looking for a valley. So I measure in about 2 inches. If I measure in another 1/2 inch, I'll put a little mark and I'll hold it up. You can see that my mark is at a valley. So from our first mark, which will represent one of the side seams, which is in a valley, we're going to measure our 28 inches, 2 inches smaller than our waist measurement because of elastic. We're going to mark 28 inches on the other side. So now what we'll do is pin the entire side seam together. We're gonna leave all this additional seam allowance. We'll cut it off after, just in case we have to make any adjustments while we're fitting. So go ahead and match up those marks. You can see my chalk mark matches on both sides, and we'll safety pin the entire side seam. So you can use your valley as a guideline. So as you see here, it's 1/2 inch in. So we'll make sure that we do this side, and then we're 1/2 inch in from the other side. So pin all the way down on this seam, and we are ready to fit the skirt. Maureen, how'd I do?
Love it.
So I pinned the skirt according to Maureen's measurements and where she wanted the skirt to sit. Do you feel like it's sitting at the right place? Smallest part of your waist?
I do, yeah, it feels good.
Okay, good. Feels secure and everything's in place? Great, so that's what you guys want at home. And if you need to adjust anything, just open up the pins and adjust as needed. And you could try it on and adjust it as many times as you need to get it perfect. So we've got our measurements all marked, and what we want to do is remove the elastic that the skirt comes with because we're attaching the tunnel elastic. Now the cool thing is the elastic it came with is stitched on with a chain stitch. That's a directional stitch that allows for stretch. And if you check both sides of your skirt, if you find the thread, which is attaching the two together, one of the ends will easily pull and will open the entire seam. Should be easy to find. Not easy. Let's check this side. Oh, here it is. So, here's our chain stitch. This comes off with one pull. So I'm going to have a good old time, I love doing this, and pull the chain stitch, removing the elastic from the skirt all the way across. You see this magic? So now the two are separating. Gets me every time, so fun. So we can put this to the side. For the tunnel elastic, we're going to use this white elastic that also came in your kit. So we've got just the skirt itself, no elastic. So now we need to cut the fabric portion of our tunnel elastic waistband, and the way we'll do that is taking the measurement of the skirt at the waist and cutting our waistband piece, this guy right here, to the exact same length. We can start from one end. We'll mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we'll take that measurement from our skirt and mark that on our waistband. You can see I'm kind of grabbing the tape measure and pulling it across. And go ahead and mark that measurement and add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So straighten out that line, add your 1/2 inch seam allowance, and cut. So we'll start from one end and we'll mark that seam allowance of 1 inch. Then we'll measure 24.5. that. Give yourself a 1-inch seam allowance from there. And you can go ahead and cut off the rest. So to check in, here's what we have. The piece of fabric for our tunnel elastic waistband, our tunnel elastic for inside of the waistband, and the skirt panel, which we're now going to cut the seam allowance off. So before we cut the seam allowance on our skirt, we're going to open up some of these pleats. What that will do is give us a flat surface to create that hidden seam. So from our chalk mark, we can go ahead using your seam ripper. This is our side seam chalk mark. Let's open up 2 inches out and 2 inches in from that seam, and we'll flatten this area of pleats so we can easily sew them together. So the way I'm gonna do this is open up this stitch. You'll see once you've taken your chain stitch out, there's a stay stitch holding all your pleats neatly in place so they don't fall apart. You see as I'm opening them, take your time with this, your pleats unfold, and this will allow us to pin and stitch directly in that valley to hide the seam. Here's our chalk line. We've got a nice flat area where we're going to be sewing our seam. We want to repeat the same step on the other side seam. Okay, so with our pleats opened up on both sides around our side seam, we're going to reference our chalked side seam here that we had done after the fitting. And we need to create a 1/2-inch seam allowance outside of that. So from that valley, or also known as our seam, we're going to mark 1/2 inch all the way down. I'm going to pick this up in a second and show you guys. So here's our valley, which is our seam, and here's our 1/2 inch seam allowance, which we're chalking. Okay, so just go ahead, take your time, and work all the way down each of the seams on both sides. So as you're working on your ironing board, just make sure that you are moving things around to not cut through your skirt or any of the pieces you've cut. So this is our 1/2 inch line, which we're going to cut on. We've marked that all the way down. So just go ahead and set yourself up, working in small increments. Just cutting through on that line. See my chalk line here. Sometimes I mark my chalk lines in dashes. I don't need to mark all the way down. I have a great eye, it can read 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you can kind of connect the lines as you're cutting. But like I said, make sure you're spreading things out. Only the layer you want to cut is in your scissor. Go ahead, finished one side, we're gonna cut the seam on the other side and pin it together for sewing. So now with our skirt panel cut and ready to pin together, let's go ahead and match up our side seams and get ready to sew this skirt together. Starting at your top with your cut edges lining up, 1/2 inch, you're gonna go ahead and pin that seam allowance. Every few inches. And remember, you're going to be sewing in the valley, so you've kind of got this built-in stitch line, which is the valley. And you can see we're perfectly pinning through on both sides, and this will be a hidden seam. So work your way down the entire side seam. The first thing we want to do is take a few measurements. So the waistband panel that came with your skirt is 4 inches wide. So what we're gonna do is take our 2-inch wide ruler, line it up against the raw edge of the fabric, and gently mark the center with small dashes on the wrong side of the fabric. Now we're going to do something called thread tracing. Thread tracing allows you to put a stitch into fabric that you'll pull out later, and it works as a placeholder. So for this print, and anytime you're thread tracing, use something that really calls attention to the thread so that you can see it on your print. For example, if you're working with black, you may want to use a white thread trace. So if you can see the color I've chosen here against my fabric, very easy to see. A thread trace is a really simple stitch. You just run along that center line like so. One single row of thread. You don't want to double this up. And you're just putting a stitch every ½ inch. The word says it all. You have thread and you're tracing a line. So you're thread tracing ½ inch all the way across. As you're stitching, make sure you've left a tail on the end where you started. So you can see here, pull this through. Leave a good couple of inches. I'd say 4 to 6 inches, so I'm just gonna go ahead and pull. I'm not tying a knot in this because I want to be able to take this out very easily, and sometimes with the knot you can't pull it out easily. So go ahead and stitch the thread trace all the way across the center of your waistband. Okay, so our thread trace is completed across the entire waistband. We can see it very clearly from both sides. So on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to measure 1 1/8 inch from our center line towards each side. The reason I'm doing 1 1/8 is because our elastic is 1 inch wide. We want to give it that extra eighth. We want to give it an extra eighth so it has room to move around smoothly in our tunnel and not buckle or fold over. So that 1/8 inch gives it a little bit of room. So go ahead and chalk mark lightly 1 1/8 on one side. Now we're completing the first side. Go ahead and flip it over, and we're going to mark 1 1/8 in the other direction, just like we did from our thread trace line. So now you've got 3 lines. Your thread trace center line and your 2 lines at 1 1/8 inch. So to one of these sides, you're going to add a ½ inch seam allowance. So from looking at this, I can already tell that this side gives us exactly a ½ inch seam allowance. Wow, that's luck. If you guys see here, this measurement is a ½ inch. On the other side, we're going to measure 3/4 of an inch from that 1 1/8 inch line. I'm going to pick this up and show you. So, all your lines are here. You've got your center thread trace line, 2 lines from the center at 1 1/8 inch. On one side, we add an additional ½ inch. On the other side, 3/4 of an inch. So you can see from our 3/4 of an inch, we have a little excess. We're going to cut that off. Go ahead and cut this all the way off. Then we're going to pin this together and get ready to sew. So for now, we're going to take our 2 side seams, small ends, with our ½ inch seam allowance. Go ahead and put those pins together. Now we're going to take your waistband and your skirt to the sewing machine. So on the side of our waistband where we added a 3/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to go 1/2 inch in from the raw edge and put a straight stitch all around the circumference. So we've sewn the side seam of our waistband, and we also put the stitch 1/2 inch from the raw edge on the 3/4 inch side, so you can see this white stitch here. What we want to do now is simply fold up on that 1/2 inch line. So if you notice, I'm working on the wrong side. I'm folding the right side over. So I'm holding this at an angle where you can see. We're gonna fold up and I'm going to place pins to hold that in place. What I find is working in small areas. So I'm pinching like this, I'm working all the way around. We've pinned all the way around. So what we want to do is press on that stitch line, making sure not to hit the head of the pins, they will melt. We're just getting a crisper, cleaner line on that fold line. So go ahead and work in small areas all the way around. What you see is putting that stitch in makes a really great fold line. It's much easier than trying to just maneuver the fabric. So folding and pressing all the way around on that line. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and sew the side seam of the tunnel elastic skirt right in our valley. Okay, so we've sewn the side seam of the skirt. And if you take note, I did a pretty good job. I've sewn right in our valley, all the way down. So what we want to do now is flip it right side out. You can see the skirts coming together. So all that planning, all those steps, the point was to get the side seam hidden in a valley. So if you take a close look, I'm actually going to line this up on the ironing board so you can see it closely. What's going to happen here is we fold, I'm going to lift it up. I'll just put a few pins so you can see. So if we pin our pleat down, you'll notice that our seam is hidden inside. So what that means is all of our pleats will look like they're going in one direction, and that seam allowance is nowhere to be seen. Ta-da! So what we want to do is repin all of the pleats we open back up in place and stitch them back down. So I'm just going to follow the direction of the pleats, folding on that line, and pin them in place. And here's where we have our disappearing side seam. So I'm going to take this off and show you. We've got our side seam hidden amongst our pleats. You can't even find it. Don't even try, you won't. So we're going to take this to the sewing machine and sew these back down. Okay, so we're just going to sew the pleats back down into place where we opened them up. Okay, so the side seam of the skirt is sewn together. We've put all our pleats back into place, and we have the tunnel waistband ready to attach to the skirt. The first thing that I want to do is find our side seam on the skirt, which is not easy because we've hidden it. So go ahead and take a look and find your side seam. So ours is hidden underneath here. You can take a look. I'm going to take a measuring tape and I'm marking in chalk 1 inch towards the back, a little tiny mark. What I want to do is line up our waistband side seam with this mark on the skirt that's 1 inch back, and that will help us avoid a lot of bulk in one place. If all our side seams are meeting at this point, it gets a little bit too heavy. So what we're going to do is pin our skirt and waistband together. So what we want to do is find the side seam of our waistband and the side that we've got 1/2 inch seam allowance. The other side, remember, we put a stitch in, so it's the side without the stitch. And we're going to pin my edge to edge. As I put a few pins in, I'll lift this up to show you guys where we're headed with this. So I'm going to pin all the way around. And remember, we cut the tunnel waistband the same size as the skirt. So everything should evenly line up in that circle. And you can see what's going to happen is as we sew this, it's going to fold up, and that's going to be the outer seam for our tunnel waistband. So go ahead, take your time, and pin all the way around. I am sewing the waistband to the skirt. So I've cut the seam allowance around the waist to 1/4 inch from 1/2 inch all the way around. So now what we want to do is flip our skirt inside out, like so. So the next step is we want to use our thread trace line as a folding line. We're going to fold down, and we're going to attach the stitch line we did a while back, the 1/2 inch stitch line from the edge, to just below our stitch line where we attach the waistband to the skirt. So let me hold this up for you guys so you can see really clearly. So here's our stitch line. We're folding on the thread trace and folding on this line, and we're going to meet this line that we're folding about 1/8 inch below that stitch line. Then on the right side, I'm going to place pins. As your pins are on your right side, what you want to make sure is when you flip it over that the inner line is falling 1/8 inch below the stitch line on the skirt. This way, as you're stitching, we'll stitch in the ditch, which is a stitch in a seam. You'll make sure to catch the inside of the waistband so it's all clean finished. This will be much clearer on the sewing machine, and I'll show you when we get to that point. So go ahead and pin your waistband in half all the way around and tuck it under so the entire skirt interior looks like this on the inside, and you're pinning to stitch on the outside with that thread trace line right at your crease. So you've pinned the waistband to be clean finished all the way around. Really important here, we need a place where we're going to insert the elastic that we don't want to stitch down. So if you notice, here's our side seam. So what we want to do is leave a 2-inch opening to insert our elastic in and pull it through. So your final pins should be 1 inch. Put them in place and then I'll show you here. So you're going to start sewing here, work your way all the way around, and then we're leaving this 2-inch area open where we are going to eventually, after we sew it, insert our elastic and close that up later. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch in the ditch, which means we are putting a stitch hidden between the 2 seams between the waistband and the skirt. So now we have our elastic to insert into our soon-to-be tunnel elastic waistband skirt. So where we left the side seam open here, we want to start tunneling our elastic through. So here's a great little tip for elastic. It's going to want to twist around as you're putting it inside, and you don't want an elastic waistband like this. So what I do is I pre-fold it So we want to make sure that one overlaps the other after it's been tunneled through. So go ahead and give yourself a little pencil dot. You're not going to see this, it's inside the skirt. You can see a little tiny dot in the middle of that seam allowance. So once you have a little pencil dot in the center of your seam allowances on the elastic, what you want to do is grab a safety pin. Make sure it's something that will fit through that 1 1/8 inch hole we made. What I'm going to do is put it right through our little pencil dot. And we are going to start tunneling our elastic through the skirt. So remember we left open. You want to insert your elastic with your little pencil hole facing the outside of the waistband. So here's my outside, here's my little pencil dot, and I'm going to start going in. This is just a push and a pull. You want to make sure as you're doing this, your elastic's not twisting. So take a look here. Here's my safety pin head. I'm pushing the fabric onto the pin and I'm pulling the fabric back this way. So you're pushing and you're pulling. You're going to do this all the way across until you meet the other end of the opening that we left. Getting to that other end. You notice, don't pull so much that your elastic pulls all the way through. You want to make sure the tail hangs out that beginning point where we started. So, we're back. So, as the elastic comes through, go ahead and bunch it up so you can work with these pieces. So if I did this properly, one dot will meet up and can lay on top of the other. I'm going to put a safety pin in just to show you guys. You can kind of test it out. Now our elastic should pull all the way through and we have no twists. So we've done it properly. So that was just to show you guys how it works. Go ahead, we'll pull this back out. And we're going to replace our safety pin with a regular pin. Make sure you hold those two together. Then we're going to head to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch a little box around this 1-inch rectangle and finish the skirt. So now we're going to go ahead and stitch a square around our 1-inch elastic. So we'll work our way from 1/8 to a 1/4 inch in towards the middle of our elastic. So make sure you pivot at the corners. So now we're going to go ahead and close that bit of the waistband that we left open to insert the elastic. So again, we're just going to continue with that stitch in the ditch. So now we're going to go ahead and close that bit of the waistband that we left open to insert the elastic. So again, we're just going to continue with that stitch in the ditch. So now I'm going to go ahead and secure my elastic in place by sewing vertically through the side seam. So now what we're going to do is fold the skirt in half from our side seam to find our other side seam. I'm going to go ahead and just put a pin there to mark the area. And now we're just going to run a stitch vertically through the other side to keep that elastic in place. Now you can go ahead and remove that thread trace by simply cutting it and pulling. You can see it's completely removed, and your skirt is finished.